Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a video on wildcard strategy, specifically my own strategy, but just me detailing what I've seen so far as other alternatives, my thoughts on them, and generally why you might not want to wildcard at all. And I think this once again comes down to the preference that you have as a manager, whether you're sometimes more patient, a little bit more risk seeking, or ultimately you have certain fixations on things or a different view on the game compared to others. So we'll talk about the dominant strategies that I think are in place. Before we jump into the video, I'd like to shout out Fantasy Football Hub. You can find them in the link in the description of this video below. But effectively, we have taken a lot of advantage from Ben Crellin's Fantasy Football spreadsheet, which is part of the premium feature for Fantasy Football Hub. You can have a look at when the international breaks start to happen, when later down the line we have blank game weeks, double game weeks, things like that to plan around, how to sort of organize around that. At the same time, I've been looking at the early fixtures slate for this season for 24-25, looking at the projections for clean sheets and goals scored from Fantasy Football Hub as well. I'd also like to shout out 11ify too. His data has really helped with the FDRs, so take a look into his website as well. What I would say is my strategy right now is loosely a wildcard 6. So clearly still targeting a lot of the early fixtures, trying not to create a team that requires too many transfers between game weeks 1 to 6 clearly, and to press the wildcard button as effectively an opportunity to move into some players that I quite like. So those would be City players, some more Arsenal players, things like that. I'll talk about the fixture swing and why I value wildcard 6. But generally speaking, it's an opportunity to reset my team without having to use too many free transfers around that time. And a lot of this has been prompted by my views on the rule changes. So what we know now is you can effectively save your free transfers over the wildcard or over a free hit. And the benefit of that is you no longer have to what we classically called a dead end. So you would, let's say, maximize a certain fixture run. You would go for certain players knowing that you, after wildcarding, would have to reduce yourself back to one free transfer. Now you can actually save free transfers through a wildcard. So you won't gain an additional free transfer through a wildcard game week, but you will actually keep whatever you saved. So you don't necessarily have to use those transfers, whereas classically you would have had to do so. So we had certain very fixated windows where a lot of people wanted and identified opportunities to kind of target a wildcard. What I would say with this season is you can probably practice patience once again, and you can actually just look at the wildcard as a bit of a security blanket because you don't have to dead end. You can just accumulate free transfers, wildcard your team in place of using those free transfers, and then save those free transfers to deal with whatever scenarios prop up for you later down the line. And the reality is we have so little information about any of the game weeks after, let's say, game weeks 5 and 6, in my opinion, particularly since we also don't know the full extent of transfers right now, that you can argue that we have a limited understanding of how to attack at some of the early fixtures, and therefore maybe planning for no wildcard at all could make a lot of sense. So that's sort of one approach to it. My approach is still, we have a good understanding of how teams are, how players will perform. I still like to look at, generally speaking, a fixture window. Obviously, we have things like rotation, some players who can be extremely interesting as budget options to start the season. We've talked about them in the cheat sheet series. So players like Bob, maybe Amad Diallo, these sorts of players who can get maybe early minutes in their legs and are quite key for some pretty good teams that you can take advantage of and then sort of dispense if you choose to do a wildcard early. If you're wildcard agnostic, I would say you have to go with a little bit more of a robust team. So that's sort of the flip side, I suppose, of the argument. Now, in terms of all the wildcards, so that's the pros and cons of not wildcarding. I would say the thing to look at, starting with the first strategy that I would say is quite competitive, is wildcard 2, bench boost 1, or even a bench boost 1, you can argue a wildcard 4. But let's just take wildcard 2 into account. So what are you targeting here? You're just targeting purely game week 1. You're trying to create a team that is bench boost 1 friendly. It probably means that you won't be going for a Haaland drop because that 2.5 million between Haaland and Salah is definitely worth saving. And I think you need that to allow yourself to have a good, strong bench for game week 1. Because when you look at some of the, for example, 4.0 defender options, they don't exactly have a great fixture in game week 1. When you look at, let's say, some of the midfielders, with exception to maybe Amad Diallo, I would still say game week 1 is a little bit tougher for most. Even Bob, for example, who's against Chelsea, that looks like a good fixture given what we saw from the preseason fixture. But you might not be so high on, let's say, the utility of a Bob right now for game week 1, as opposed to, let's say, the utility of Bob if he was to start versus Ipswich in game week 2. So that's just something to consider. And what are the best fixtures in game week 1? Well, very clearly, it's going to be Arsenal, Newcastle, Liverpool. I would say those are the 3 teams that I've targeted quite heavily. I would definitely also consider Man United. From a defensive point of view, it would once again be Arsenal, Newcastle, and Liverpool. So you have an opportunity simply to go for a Newcastle defender, an Arsenal defender, and Trent. You might even want to go for potentially a Brentford goalkeeper as well. I think Flecken makes a lot of sense for this window. And then in the midfield and the attacking positions, going back to it, Isak, Gordon, and Mbumo, Arsenal players, Liverpool players, these are the ones that I would definitely target. But then you have options like Amad Diallo, who has a good fixture here. In terms of Spurs, you can also say that they have a good fixture both on both ends. So Porro, these sorts of options, or even attacking options from Spurs can definitely be considered as well. Now, it seems like Kulusevski might not start the season as a 9. We'll find out soon, but that also means you could be open towards an option like Brennan Johnson, particularly within the midfield. And these are the kind of picks that I would look at here. What is the benefit of this strategy? So you get to take into account some of the players who we know will start, who will probably be moved out of their team. So once again, I say Amad Diallo, even Bob, I would say definitely can be held that sort of regard as well. I think he's a very interesting pick, despite it being an away fixture. It's still a new look Chelsea. They haven't looked particularly great on defense so far, and it's still City. So it's still a nice fixture to target some budget options. You have midfielders there in the attacking positions. In the forward line, it's not exactly the best. I would say Chris Wood is probably the most interesting because we definitely think that he will start this fixture here in game week 1. It's a nice game. It's a home game. We doubt Awani will take away too many of his minutes at the exact start of the season. Later into the season, we might think that Awani can take minutes away from him, and that's when Wood and his value would decrease. But here, simply going for game week 1, you wouldn't really lose too much out of it. And then going back to Arsenal, Newcastle, lots of players that you can spend the funds on. The main con of this is that clearly you lose the opportunity to bench boost later down the line in the season. I don't like the idea of going for Wildcard 1 or Wildcard 2 because it's very ambitious. It also means you lose the opportunity to react accordingly to how you might feel certain teams and certain players are performing. So let's say a few weeks down the line, if you've gone for Ahmad at game week 1, and you've decided not to wildcard in game week 2, then your team's going to be a little bit weaker. At the same time, if you decide to wildcard 2, which is very normal off of the bench boost because you want to maximize the starting 11 as much as possible, you might not be able to do so in a great way where you might be looking at some teams like Chelsea. You might be very high on them because the fixture run is very good, but you might not necessarily love Chelsea a few game weeks into the season when we've had a chance to watch them play versus some weaker teams outside of Man City. So that's something to think about. The same applies to some other teams too. So potentially Spurs, we might have higher or lower estimations of them. The same with Aston Villa and so on and so forth. So we don't necessarily get enough understanding, I suppose, of what is the changing of the guard with teams and maybe even certain players that really become very important at the start of the season. Last season, we had Julian Alvarez for a very short stint, was basically nailed within the Man City team. That changed a lot of team structures and a lot of drafts, but not many people were able to react accordingly to it. And particularly if you wildcarded on game week 2, you definitely would have missed, I suppose, the opportunity to kind of foresee that happening with Julian Alvarez when he became a pretty popular transfer last season in game weeks 3 or 4. So that's something to think about. You definitely are going very early. You will definitely have a big lead. You have the opportunity to target some great fixtures here, and it looks like a free hit. So it's quite nice. But you definitely do lose the opportunity to maybe have the security blanket aspect of the wild card in this new season. And you also lose the opportunity to bench boost potentially with higher team value later down the line in the season. Although, as we know, pricing has been pretty competitive. It might not be the case that the bench boost later in the season will be as good as it has been in the last 2 seasons. So that's something to think about as well. Now, Wildcard 4, what are the pros and cons of this? For me, the pros is that it's a very strong narrative wildcard. You get to build a wildcard around after the transfer window closes, and you get the full information in terms of teams from that aspect. You also get the advantage of it being an international break. So in case there are any injuries, in case there's a lot of price action, so let's say a lot of buying and selling of certain players, people maybe wanting to completely switch up their teams, having saved maybe three transfers at the time, wanting to use those free transfers, you get to take into account those things and bank in those price rises. What I don't love about it so much is I still feel like on a wildcard 4, the issue is life after wildcard 4, because you're looking at teams, and this is the major con for me, you're looking at teams like City and Arsenal to target, but you're still going to be investing into them in their worst fixtures on paper. So this applies to even Tottenham as well. Arsenal versus Tottenham game week 4, and then Arsenal versus Man City in game week 5 isn't exactly the fixture where you really want to be owning City players for the 2 game weeks 4, Arsenal players for the 2 game weeks 4. So it's a little bit of a tricky window. I still think it's a great window to, once again, have a look at that new look Liverpool. You'll have the pro of being able to see what we see with Slot. Maybe it's Harvey Elliott who actually benefits the most under Slot, playing as a 10 right now in the preseason, but we won't have the same level of comfort in game week 1 as we do in game week 4. So it's also a nice window to take into account potential huge tactical shifts and importance shifts within certain teams. So a team like Man City, I talked about Oscar Bob, he could still find himself to be a starter by game week 4. And that could be a dramatic shift that you can still build your team around. Which is very nice if you start the season just targeting the first 3 fixtures of the season. Another thing that I think is nice, once again, with transfers is things like, Tony being transferred, Solanke being transferred. That can still happen later into the season, particularly after game week 1. And so that narrative window is very important as well. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that because it can be quite dramatic in FPL. You might suddenly reevaluate how good Mbeumo is after Brentford's early fixtures, although I do recognize that the fixture run after the first 3 games is still pretty tough. So that's just something to mention. What is the benefit of targeting wildcard 4 from a fixture point of view? So the fixture point of view is, I would still say, very good for City, very good for Liverpool, not exactly the best for Arsenal, but at the same time, you have 2 good fixtures for Arsenal, as opposed to when you look at, let's say, a run of games between, let's say, 1 and 5, 3 out of 5 tough fixtures for Arsenal, and then 2 good fixtures still. So when you look at, let's say, Arsenal's early run, it's actually still contained within the first 3 game weeks. The 2 out of 3 games that I would say are good, and that would be Brighton at home and Wolves at home. So Wolves at home is probably their best game in the season up until game week 6. So when you think about it like that, it's a good opportunity to go for Arsenal players who I can see are not sitting in a lot of content creator drafts, a lot of engaged manager drafts. And so good opportunity to attack Arsenal, certainly. I think it's also a great time to just simply target Newcastle's great run of fixtures from the start. So that means going into Gordon Isak, maybe going for a Newcastle defender as well, tripling up on them very much like you would on potentially a wildcard 2, and taking advantage of the great early fixtures there. The same can apply to Brentford too. I think they have 2 great home fixtures, very much like Arsenal. So you can see it as an opportunity to go for Flecken as your goalkeeper, to go for Mbeumo as a differential, and things like that. What I do like about this window too is you can still go for players who, let's say, play for teams like Crystal Palace and even, let's say, Nottingham Forest. They generally have a good clean run. They generally have a good clean run to start the season, and you can go for those players without feeling too bad about that you're highly invested into certain players. So let's say with Eze, with players like maybe Chris Wood, you would feel quite confident about their minutes for the start of the season, and then you can dump them off after game week 4, where you can, once again, once you've re-evaluated some of the teams and how you like them, you can jump on to another fixture window, which is going to be Aston Villa's great run of games, Chelsea's great run of games, which still remain in place effectively after the City game, Brighton's run of fixtures as well. So a lot of people are looking at a player like Yankuba Minte. He's actually someone who's very interesting to look at after game week 3. So when you look at wildcard 4, it's a great window to jump into the correct cheap budget assets within the game without having to spend free transfers on the weaker players within your teams, right? Because if you think about it from a sort of transfer benefit perspective, or like an expected points perspective, if you're moving between, let's say, a good run of fixtures between Saka versus Palmer versus Foden versus Saka, you get the benefit, generally speaking, of more expected points gained by making a transfer between certain players, between certain fixture runs. Whereas, let's say, if you're moving between a 5.5 midfielder and another 5.5 midfielder, unless that 5.5 midfielder was Palmer last season, it's more than likely that that player is going to have less importance in your team, and you wouldn't have the opportunity always to spend a free transfer on that sort of player. So it gives you an opportunity to reevaluate some of the 4.5 defenders as well, some of those cheap picks early on, and then target some great fixture runs that we have for teams outside of the top 3, which would be, as I said, Aston Villa, Chelsea, and Brighton. It's also a good opportunity to look at a team like Man United and Spurs after having watched them play for 3 fixtures, and then changing an early season expectation of these players, which I think is quite nice. The main con for me of Wildcard 4 is I still think that there is a big fixture swing, as I said, in Game Week 6. So once you wildcard in Game Week 4, what you're sort of losing the value of is the importance of maximizing around the Man City and Arsenal aspect of your team. Because if you, let's say, go on a wildcard 4, you try to ignore the Man City and Arsenal players on your wildcard, you're still going to have to feel like you want to move into them by wildcard 6. Or not wildcard 6 rather, but you're still going to feel like you want to move into them by Game Week 6, which means that you will have to spend free transfers that you might have stockpiled back into those Arsenal City players. Or the alternative is that you start the wildcard 4 with some City players and Arsenal players, but you're still, as I said, going to have to suffer through the Spurs games, the City and Arsenal head to head, and you might actually lose a bit of value there, because what really is the point of wildcarding if the best players in your team still are going to have tougher fixtures? Whereas if you were, let's say, someone who's planning a wildcard 6, which I'll jump into right now, you can ignore a little bit more Arsenal and City, I would say, conceivably, and then jump onto them without having to use any free transfers whatsoever via the wildcard. So that is a small point of concern that I have. I just think that from a fixture perspective, it's not exactly a great window, even though you can definitely improve the outer edge of your team. So the non-City, the non-Arsenal, or even the non-Liverpool aspect of your team. So what is my strategy and what is wildcard 6? I would say wildcard 6 is also very similar to wildcard 7. It really comes down to how you plan to target fixtures. What I would say is the main difference between wildcard 6 and 7 is that 7 is where you land on that best City fixture and a great run of games after that. Whereas wildcard 6 is where the Arsenal run of games start to come really good. And I'd rather target the first fixture that is good for both of those teams before jumping on a week later, which would be that Man City fixture in Game Week 7. At the same time, wildcard 6 is quite nice in that it's sandwiched between both the international breaks. So you would have had the benefit, once again, of seeing what the transfers are that are key for the start of the season, potentially seeing what are the big international break injuries, and then being able to use that information to wildcard in Game Week 6. Maybe around Champions League time as well, you get a little bit of a sense of rotation and you get to activate the wildcard there. But as I said, this is more of a fixture-based wildcard. It is not necessarily the case where I would call it a good narrative window to wildcard, because it's still, generally speaking, is better to probably wildcard on international breaks and so on and so forth to target, let's say, those injuries if you really want to do so, or those price rises, because that's how a lot of historical FPL managers look at wildcards as well, and maybe they're going to be inclined to a wildcard 8, just like wildcard 8 was super popular last season. But as I said, I don't think international injuries are always that important. Neither is wildcarding on an international break. So this is a fixture-based wildcard, and we'll talk about what the pros and cons for it are. So the pros for me, as I said, when you look at targeting game weeks 1 to 5, is simply the benefit of going for these Newcastle players to start. So you can actually look at players like Isak as players you can just keep within the team. Chelsea as well, generally speaking, after game week 1 have a great window. There's nothing wrong with actually going for certain players within those teams. The only teams that I would say have weaker runs of games at the start would be Brighton, Brentford. So you ignore some of these teams because the game week 1 to 5 stretch for them isn't particularly good. Instead, you're investing in Newcastle, Spurs, Liverpool, potentially Chelsea with Nkunku, which is very popular right now. And then also you have the advantage of players like Armstrong, who actually have a good run of games at the start of the season. So when you look at game weeks 2 and 5, great opportunities to play someone like Armstrong. But because those fixtures are so good, even for a much weaker team in terms of our expectations for offense this season within Southampton, you can still actually see that Armstrong, being a really good X-Men's player, can be someone that you can start permanently. And this applies as well to a Fulham player, right? Fulham is probably the best team to really look at for wildcard 6 in specific, because they actually, generally speaking, have a great run of games after game week 1. So after that Man United away fixture, you can play almost a Fulham player every single week, I would say, at that sort of 5.5 range, which Smith Rowe is currently sitting, or Andreas is currently sitting. Or at that 6.0 range, which Muniz is sitting. You can even target someone like Anthony Robinson as well. He's someone who's quite interesting around this run. What I don't love about this window, I suppose, is when you're targeting these fixtures, it kind of wants you to switch off from maybe as many City players as you want. It might switch you off from some of the Arsenal players too. So with exception to, let's say, someone like Saka, who I think is quite nice because he covers what I would consider are maybe bad weeks for Haaland captaincy. So I kind of like a game week 1 captaincy towards Isak or Saka more so than Haaland right now. And then when I look at game week 5, you can use that Saka position in the team to transfer him into someone like Heung-min Son or even Foden potentially. But in reality, I kind of see that as an opportunity to revisit maybe the Salah transfer, because actually you can spend 2 free transfers to go into Salah and Watkins in place of, let's say, Haaland and Saka. And that's actually a really nice 2 free transfer setup there. Or you can also be looking at something like simply going from Saka to Son on let's say, game week 5, covering the somewhat poor captaincy choice in that week there, where Spurs actually have a pretty good fixture. It's Brentford at home. You can see it as an opportunity to go against Salah once again within the Haaland-only structure. So that's part of the thinking in my mind, where if I'm on Wildcard 6, I quite like intuitively going still Haaland only to capture the game week 2 captaincy. But the alternative is just simply going for a Salah only draft. And you can see that Liverpool have such a clean run of games between game weeks 1 to 5. Their first tough game, I would say, is probably game week 7 for Liverpool. Maybe you can argue that it only really happens in game week 9, let's say. But it's a nice opportunity, as I said, to target a team like Liverpool too. So if you're someone who's on a Salah only draft, you don't want to use any free transfers, your main carry option, your captaincy, is going to be within a Salah only structure here, and nothing will really affect him between game weeks 1 to 5. It will feel quite comfortable going against Haaland, I would say, within a Salah only structure here too. So it works quite well in both ways. Either way you target it, it might use more free transfers on the Haaland path, but that's just unfortunately the way of the land, I suppose. It really depends on how you view captaincies as well. As I said, you can swerve the Salah option by simply going for Son on game week 5, and that's going to be worse than a Salah captaincy on expectations, but it might actually perform quite well, and you get to keep Haaland in place. What's nice about the Wildcard 6 is you can move into, let's say, teams that we'd have a little bit of an assessment on at the start of the season that then have a pretty good fixture swing. So after game week 5, you're basically looking at 6+. So then it's actually, once again, a great Arsenal fixture, an okay City fixture, but not a great one, clearly one of the worst ones within their run. But you're more so switching into at least a team structure that you're happy with, that has enough City and Arsenal players before they actually have a great run of games both. And then with Liverpool, I would say their fixtures decline a little bit in terms of importance. So maybe you can drop off someone like Trent within your drafts. I find that Trent is quite locked into a lot of people's drafts, but then you can actually see that game week 6 is an opportunity to drop off Trent a little bit ahead of schedule. As far as, let's say, teams like Spurs, Chelsea, Man United, you get a little bit of an opportunity to have a look at them. That will give you a chance to revisit whether you want to go into players like Rashford, maybe some other Spurs players like Brennan Johnson potentially, or within Chelsea, maybe revisiting whether you want to strengthen within maybe their defense. And our conception of their defense could very well change then. But more importantly, within, I would say, the mid-table, you've got teams like Brentford and West Ham and even Aston Villa still, or Brighton, where you can sort of reconsider whether you want to go into these players. What I think is tricky with Aston Villa and Brighton is that you do lose the narrative, you do lose the fixture window really for them, because game weeks 4 and 5 for Aston Villa are really good. So you do miss out on that window. And the same applies to Brighton too. So because you miss on that window, you only get a little bit of a late sort of expectation and understanding of whether to move into players like Mintage, Pedro, etc. So it's not exactly that nice for that. But you get a great Brentford fixture run, because you would have gotten rid of, unfortunately, Brentford's really tough games in game week 4 in particular. And then obviously you would have seen through game week 2 as well, which are their tougher games. After that, it's a pretty good run of games for Brentford. So I kind of like the idea of targeting Brentford and West Ham as well. They've had a lot of transfers this season. It seems like they actually have a lot of depth in attack too. So it's such opportunity to see whether we think they're the real deal. And you can actually then move into players like maybe Bowen still, or actually choose between some of the newer wingers within Kudus and Somerville, and even someone like Fulkrug, who might be on penalties at the time. We might find out, and we might hold him in high esteem as a pick going forwards from game week 6. And as I said, it's a fixture window that I like the most, because at the end of the day, we expect that most of our points are going to come from top teams and top players. So from a fixture window perspective, even though you might miss out on, let's say, a Brighton window or an Aston Villa window, you're still taking advantage of the big swing, which is for City and for Arsenal. So generally speaking, that's why I'm on a wildcard 6 structure. I think that if you decide to go no wildcard, that's totally fine. If I was building a wildcard agnostic draft, I don't think that any of the drafts that I've submitted so far for you guys to have a look at are actually too far different. I would probably say that it actually is possible to have quite deep defensive rotation at the start of the season, particularly if you're on, let's say, a Salah only draft. If I was wildcard agnostic, I might consider just going for Salah, because it feels like quite easy to just stick on, let's say, Salah only captaincies at the start. You might have to just wear padded armor in game week 2 and suffer through that, but it's an opportunity to have a little bit more of a mixed draft and then see whether there is actually a big sort of injury swing, big window where you need that security blanket of a wild card later down the line, as opposed to being too aggressive at the start and actually using the wild card maybe a little bit prematurely. But what I like about the premature wild card this season, as I said, is simply because if you get to save some of your early free transfers and you get to wild card early on without having used too many of them, then the benefit of using that early wild card is then you still have the security blanket within those saved free transfers, and then the wildcard also allows you to target an early fixture swing or an early narrative swing. So that's sort of my thoughts on the wildcard. Let me know what your thoughts are. What kind of wildcard strategies do you guys have in mind? Are you looking at a little bit of a later wildcard? Because that's also an opportunity too, right? If you're wildcard agnostic, the whole point is that you're trying to use your wildcard a little bit later into the first half of the season. So game weeks 12 plus, I would say, or even using it at the penultimate game week, which would be game week 20. But how you plan to do that is really up to you and your preference. There's a lot of benefits to early wildcarding. I'm a little bit more minded towards it because I do like capturing my price rises. That's just within my nature, but more specifically when it's also coinciding with good swings. So those are my thoughts on wildcard. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.